What's going on, everyone? The National Security Strategy 2022 just dropped, which makes it sound a lot cooler than it is. Came out, was released, was published yesterday, I believe, October 12th, 2022. Or yesterday was the first day I saw it. Anyways, so I thought what we'd do is pull it up here, walk through it a little bit, and I highlighted a handful of areas that I thought were at least somewhat interesting to dive into. So at a high level, the national security strategy is something put out by the executive branch whenever they want. Compare that with the national defense strategy, which comes out every 4 years and put together by the Pentagon. The national security strategy, this is the first one under the Biden administration. They put out like an interim one in 2022. Prior to that, the last was in 2017. And the focus of this, and I'm going to say this quite a few times in this video just because I think it's important, is this is a political document. Like, you cannot separate politics from this document. And that doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind. So there's some messaging in here towards potential future policies, things like that. So the national security strategy is designed for the president or the executive branch to lay out their priorities, their focus for national security, as well as either existing programs that are helping to thwart those or to combat those, as well as like ideas and proposals, maybe is a way to put it. So you'll see some things in here that don't exist yet, but it might be the start of a roadmap for something that the Biden administration is looking towards down the road. Now, this is a public document. I'll post a link to it in the video description here so you can take a look. It's not too awful long, like 48 pages. Some areas, I'm going to be totally honest, some areas I found pretty dry, others more interesting, but take a look if you want. So the table of contents I wanted to point out at first, just because it's a mixed bag. I'm really going to zero in on part 3 there, our global priorities, and most of this video is going to be focused on China and Russia. But it kind of hits on a lot of things in a good way. There's a lot around domestic production, the CHIPS Act, things like that. What are some of these? Strengthening our democracy, investing in our people, a prosperous world, right? So not necessarily, I think there's some climate change stuff in here as well. So it's not necessarily directly tied to military and the Pentagon and so on, but it hits a lot of areas. Those tend to not be some of the areas I focus on or am as spun up on, if you will. When it gets to climate change, for instance, while I'm getting to the China piece here, I might be old-fashioned and I might just be wrong, but it's hard for me to include something like climate change in a conversation with like the geopolitical struggles with Russia and China, right? It seems like a different type of conversation, a whole different category, but again, maybe I'm old-fashioned, maybe I'm just wrong. So moving down to part 3, like I said, this is really where we're going to focus here, our global priorities. Right here, spelled out, large print, I think this kind of sums up the whole national security strategy. Out-competing China and constraining Russia. And to go back and say this is a political document, the wording matters, where things are put in here matters. What you're going to get from this document today is that China is the priority. You can't have 2 priorities. You can have one. And the executive branch, as per this national security strategy, is listing China as the number 1 priority for U.S. national security in 2022. So there's a couple lines I'm going to read, a couple paragraphs I'm going to read from this because I think it's important. I'll start here. The PRC and Russia, PRC, People's Republic of China, and Russia are increasingly aligned with each other, but the challenges they pose are in important ways distinct. We will prioritize maintaining an enduring competitive edge over the PRC while containing a still profoundly dangerous Russia. And then to get into specifically China here, I do think this is important. The PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Beijing has ambitions to create an enhanced sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and become the world's leading power. It is using technological capacity and increasing influence over international institutions to create more permissive conditions for its own authoritarian model. So that stuff those are terms and phrases you don't really hear thrown out there with Russia. And I thought it was interesting. I mean, Russia is the one of these two that is conducting an active war right now. We're sitting here in the middle of October, and there's real concerns that what Russia does or fails to do could lead to nuclear escalation and potentially a greater conflict with NATO or the West. You blink and there's a world war. I mean, for that not to be listed as the top national security priority, I think says a lot. I think it probably shows just how concerned our leaders are about China. Something to think about. I'm going to stay on here, moving down through China a little bit. I don't agree with everything in here. There's some things I'll get to that I think are great, really good phrases, really good plans, hopes, and aspirations. Others that I'm not necessarily sold on quite yet, and this is one of those. It says, we will hold Beijing accountable for abuses, genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, human rights violations in Tibet, and the dismantling of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms, even as it seeks to pressure countries and communities into silence. I feel like we say that, and nothing really changes, and we don't do much about it. I could be wrong, and before we go too far down the China rabbit hole here, I'll be the first to say I'm not an expert on China, not an expert on Chinese-Taiwan relations or Chinese-U.S. relations, and far from it. But it does seem like for years now, as long as I can remember, we talk the talk with China, but we don't really walk the walk. It seems like there's always some point we're too nervous about crossing to offend them, or whatever it might be. So, I'm glad this language is in there, but we'll see if it actually comes to fruition. Another part I wanted to include here, specifically around China and Taiwan, down at the bottom, it says we have an abiding interest in maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, which is critical to regional and global security and prosperity and a matter of international concern and attention. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side and do not support Taiwan independence. That has been the U.S. policy for a long time, but I think the way that we support Taiwan, and it gets into it down here at the bottom, we'll uphold our commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act to support Taiwan's self-defense and maintain our capacity to resist any resort to force or coercion against Taiwan. So it's complicated. We're doing what we can in a lot of ways to protect Taiwan from China, but also over and again right here saying we're not going to go to the point of helping Taiwan seek independence. So it's complicated. I feel like a lot of the ways that the conflict, or maybe I should say tensions rather than conflict, the tensions between China and Taiwan, I feel like make it seem as though Taiwan is seeking independence and the U.S. is supportive of that. And the U.S. we really haven't changed our position ever. It's the one China policy, as far as I'm concerned. I think it calls it out here. But yeah, that's a tricky one. We're going to scroll down to the bottom here for China before we get into Russia. I really liked this sentence. I'm glad it was included because I think we're bad about this just as people in general. While we have profound differences with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, those differences are between governments and systems, not between our people. I love that that's here, and we're just really bad at that. People, we humans, we vilify and demonize our adversaries. We have forever, and it's so easy to group them all into one bucket. Right, and we'll use the current conflict in Ukraine as an example. All Russians are bad. All Russians are evil. There are some Russians that are doing bad things. There are some in the, or the majority. Don't mean to discount this. There's within the government people that are doing bad things and ordering bad things that we are morally opposed to. But that doesn't mean that every Russian citizen feels the same. And it's a hard line to draw because that's a faceless person, right? The young mother the young single mother in Moscow trying to raise her child might have zero interest in what's going on in Ukraine. And if she lived next door to us or to you, maybe you'd have a lot in common and be good friends. Or the old shopkeeper and the old Russian shopkeeper that's just trying to provide for his family. may be opposed to everything that's happening in Ukraine, but it's difficult for us to parse that person out. Even if the percentage is 99-1, that's a lot of people that don't represent their government. And whether it's China, whether it's Russia, and historically, whether it's been our adversary. So I'm glad that that's included here. Moving into Russia, not as much here that I wanted to call out, really focused on the war in Ukraine. The document says, alongside our allies and partners, America is helping to make Russia's war on Ukraine a strategic failure. Before I comment on that, I want to add this second part here. Putin's war has profoundly diminished Russia's status vis-a-vis China and other Asian powers such as India and Japan. Moscow's soft power and diplomatic influence have waned, while its efforts to weaponize energy have backfired. So, I got a lot of thoughts on that. First off, we could very well look back on this conflict in 50 or 100 years, and we don't know how it ends, right? So it's entirely possible that Russia wins this conflict, whatever that might look like. But even if today Russia were to achieve all of their aims that they laid out at various points throughout the conflict, so pick one, right? Pick one of the sets of victory. If they were to achieve that today, I'd be hard-pressed to believe any country around the world looks at that and says, I'd like a piece of that. That worked out well for Russia. I'm going to try to carry out that same type of operation, war, whatever, in our area of the world. They've just been, Russia's been hurt economically. They've been isolated on the global stage. They've been condemned on the world stage. They have allies kind of shrinking into the distance. They have big allies. I think India just this last week made some comments about how they're against what's happening in Ukraine. They kind of walked the line. I don't think they said they're against what Russia's doing in Ukraine. One of those political kind of toe the line thing. It was something along the lines, I should look this up, but it was along the lines of they support peace in Ukraine and they want the war to stop kind of thing without outright bashing Russia. But that's a really big deal. China hasn't been overtly in support of Russia. That's a really big deal. They haven't gone so far as to condemn what Russia's doing, but there's no doubt that their standing in the world has taken a hit. No matter how it is, no matter what happens in the next days, weeks, months, and years, I would say at this point, it is looking like a strategic failure. One man's opinion. The second part of this, I'm not really on board with, not convinced of yet, where it says its efforts to weaponize energy have backfired, talking about Russia. I don't think we can say that definitively quite yet. I look at that similar to a blockade, like you'd see in World War I or World War II, even further back. That's a long-term play, not a short-term issue. So I think it's possible to see effects short-term, but for the full impact of what energy blackmail or weaponizing energy might do to Europe and to the world, I think that's going to take some time to play out, and I don't know that we've seen the full extent of it quite yet. It might backfire. It might have some impact. Have to wait and see there. Scrolling down a little further here with Russia, there were a couple points called out that I thought were interesting. A couple not so new, just reiterating, and then a couple that stood out. First, the United States will continue to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom. We will help Ukraine recover economically, and we will encourage its regional integration with the European Union. The economic rebuilding of Ukraine is a substantial effort. If the fighting stopped today, in the middle of October 2022, the economic burden of bringing that country, this is not maybe the right term, but bringing them back online, rebuilding the communities, rebuilding the roads and the bridges and the factory, that is a substantial task. I thought it was interesting that in the national security strategy, the U.S. calls that out, essentially saying we're on board. We're going to be here for that. Second, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory. Nothing new there. Third, the United States will deter and, as necessary, respond to Russian actions that threaten core U.S. interests, including Russian attacks on our infrastructure and our democracy. Also, nothing really new there. I think over the last few years, we've started to add that piece, attacks on our democracy, as opposed to just infrastructure. But nothing out of the ordinary. We kind of expect to see that. But this last one, fourth, Russia's conventional military will have been weakened, which will likely increase Moscow's reliance on nuclear weapons in its military planning. The United States will not allow Russia or any power to achieve its objectives through using or threatening to use nuclear weapons. This is something that's been on my mind for a while, really since the conflict started. I think it's pretty safe to say that Russia's military today is not as strong as they were when the war started. However you want to measure that. If it's the personnel lost, if it's the aircraft lost, the missiles fired, the ammunition, they have less ammunition today than they did 6 months ago, 7 months ago. They have fewer tanks today than they did at the start of the war. There's so many different metrics you can use to say that their conventional military power is not today what it was. That doesn't mean that it will forever be like that, but my concern as that starts happening, and there's no solution to this, right? My concern is the weaker a conventional military, the shorter the timeline is, or the shorter the threshold is to begin nuclear threats, which makes sense, right? If you don't have a conventional force able to hold the line, if you don't have a conventional force that can exert control wherever it might be, you're quicker to move to a nuclear option, whether that means testing or actually use. But there's no solution to that, right? You don't say, well, let Russia's military build up power so they're stronger and they don't have to use nukes. That doesn't make sense. But it is something back of mind, for me at least, and I've heard a lot of folks mention that since the war began. Last piece here is getting into terrorism. So there's, this would have been the focus for a long, long time. China and Russia have always been on the national security strategy, but for especially in the years after 9/11, terrorism was really kind of leading the focus in a lot of ways. And I was happy to see this line highlighted. Around the world, we will increase cooperation and support to trusted partners, shifting from a strategy that is U.S.-led, partner-enabled, to one that is partner-led, U.S.-enabled. I like that. I think it's safe to say now that what we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan did not work. I don't know that I have an answer. I don't think it's a matter of we didn't do it this way, we did it the wrong way. I don't think we know what the right way was. But what we've been doing really since Vietnam, for the most part, and there's exceptions, is this U.S.-led partner-enabled. There's more U.S. forces, more U.S. assets in an area, and you might have indigenous forces or local forces tied in with you. But something that came to mind when I read this was a saying we used to hear in Afghanistan all the time, which was, you need to find an Afghan solution to an Afghan problem. And generally what that means is the people of Afghanistan, the military, the government, anything inside the borders of that country, they have their own unique cultural problems and issues they have to sort through that require their own unique cultural, historical solutions. And when we look at the problem through our Western eyes, through our American eyes, and then try to solve it in an American way, it doesn't always jive up short term, let alone long term. And I think, again, now we can say that may not have been the right way to do things. So I don't know if there's any action behind this yet. I don't know how this applies to Ukraine per se, or if it's focused. It's under the terrorism section. I don't know if it's focused more on low intensity conflict, counterinsurgency type things. But I at least like that this is being looked at. That there's a recognition that kind of the U.S. leading the way in those types of fights might not be the best method for success. But that's it for the National Security Strategy 2022. Just a quick once-over. I'll, again, put the link to the document in the video description if you want to take a read. 48 pages. Not too bad. But that's about it for now. We'll see you next time.